Hello and welcome to One on One. I'm Vernon Ramesar, and I'm pleased to say my guest today is Dr. Visham Bhimull, who is here to talk about the language of the indentured laborers, not the concept itself, but an actual event at the Lloyd Best Institute being held tomorrow, which will be today, depending on when the program airs,
right,
which is Friday, the 24th.
Yes.
Dr. Bhimull, welcome to the program.
Pleased to meet you.
We're one of the people who we met through Facebook, which I think one of the wonderful things about this show, you can interact with Facebook and then do a show on it afterwards.
That's true.
First of all, I'm going to ask you, I asked you before the show, but just for the benefit of those in the audience, you are actually not just a doctor by title or from some obscure university, you're an actual medical doctor.
Yes.
And this is a linguistic exercise we're talking about, a presentation. How did you get involved in this?
I grew up really close to my grandparents. That's my maternal grandparents. And that environment, the language was there. And it was something I always admired. When I started going to primary and secondary school, which was Presbyterian, I actually was exposed to mainstream Trinidad and Christianity and all that, which I wasn't brought up in that.
What area of the country did you grow up in?
No, with respect to at home, traditions we practiced.
But it varies by region of Trinidad and Tobago as well. If you're from south or central, it tends to be more intense.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, I mean, from the media, and so you learn about Christianity, and it was less so in the community because it was more a Hindu community, not isolated. So, but we would have interaction. But me learning more about it was from secondary school, and then I thought to myself that a lot of things I grew up with, most of the people who I interacted at school didn't really have a general knowledge or the interaction at on a daily basis as much as me. And I thought to myself, even the language, and I thought it was, to me, the concept of a language being a form of identity was a big deal. I thought that it was part of the tradition, and it's something I always wanted to recapture. When I went to university, I learned standard Hindi, but I was able now to look at a comparison of what I heard at home versus what was formal Hindi. And it was two different things. That made it more sense of identity for me because it made me unique as a Trinidad Indian from Trinidad as opposed to of Indian descent than somebody from India. Right. As a result of that, I wanted to know everything about the language, and I just went off on that.
While at the same time pursuing medicine.
Yes, because when I did pursue medicine, I did Hindi. And you did at university as well at the same time, because at that time.
But I think for most people, medicine alone by itself is difficult enough, sure. But
it was indeed, mind you. I did my postgrad. I'm now doing French on Saturdays at Alliance, but
it's just a hopeless case, basically.
That's so true.
But I think it's interesting when you mentioned the fact that your background, and I'm bringing this in context of what we're talking about, was such that you knew you were a little different, and you learned about the Christianity and things like that after you left home and started pursuing your schooling.
It was early, after the age of 5, when I actually started going to school. There were more interaction with people who actually practiced those things and had conversations with them.
So it became a real thing as opposed to
something you would hear your parents would talk about.
But a lot of people who when exposed to that will become, there's a process of assimilation where you tend to sort of let yourself be assimilated into the larger homogeneous whole instead of necessarily holding on to your own unique sort of background. What is it about you that made you want to sort of hold on to your background and not just say, listen, I'm part of the generic English-speaking normal society and don't judge me?
It is a point. I mean, even being a Trinidadian and speaking Trinidad Creole English, recently you would have known that they now, actually the Ministry of Education is looking at teaching English as a second language to Trinidadians.
I was hearing that in Parliament, yeah.
And as a result of that, I thought to myself, well, finally they realized Trinidad Creole English is not standard English in a separate language. Just like patois is to standard French. It follows its own rules, semantics, grammar, everything. And as a result of that, me being Trinidadian and a lot of the things I would do and say, sometimes because I grew up with my grandparents so much, I'd use words that even my peers can't understand. And I do it so naturally. For instance, example, so that an old cloth you'd use to pick up a pot or wipe the kitchen table was called a saphi, from the Hindi saf. We don't say fa in local dialect, we say pa.
Okay.
Yeah? And I knew it as a saphi, and I knew a potcloth as something else at home. Only when I got older I realized, but it's the same thing. So this is just one example of few words that I would have known the Hindi word because I grew up with my grandparents, and then maybe at the age of 5, 6, 7, just assimilated it to the English word and realized, but it was the same thing I was talking about, but I just knew it by something else. That speaks of something unique, you know?
And when we talk of the language of the indentured laborer, now I have something of an interest in this because I mean my cousin Peggy Mohan, Dr. Peggy Mohan, has been on this program before talking about her background, and we're going to get in a little discussion about this because she wrote her PhD thesis on Bhojpuri.
Yes.
And I know that's a terminology that you yourself don't use.
Right.
You use a different term, and I'm wondering why.
All right. Now, whenever I asked my grandparents what language they spoke, they wouldn't say Bhojpuri. They'd say two words they refer to it as. One was Indian, and the other one was Hindustani. When I grew up, when I was small and in school, and we started learning about the history of Trinidad and Tobago, bringing Indians into that context, and they spoke about the language, they said that it was a tutti-putti Hindi, broken Hindi that they spoke. Later on, I realized that it was Bhojpuri by its formal name. But when I go back to my grandparents and ask them Bhojpuri, they were like, we don't know what that is. We know Hindustani. And then it got me to think, going back and thinking that pre-partition India, the reference to language in this situation is completely different from post-partition India. The India we see today is post-partition. The India that the colonial Indian diaspora in Trinidad came from is a pre-partition India, before the separation of India and Pakistan, and that whole philosophy. And as a result of that, if you go back to the references, they would refer to any dialect in northern India as Hindustani. Punjabi, Gujarati, Bhojpuri, Awadhi, Maithili, Magahi, all was Hindustani. Only after the partition of India did people want a sense of identity, and they started reclaiming their own vernaculars and giving it a name. So the name Bhojpuri, from my research and what I've done, seems to be something that came up after partition. As a result, the Indians in Trinidad didn't really know what Bhojpuri is because it came up after they left.
So Hindustani would have been the umbrella blanket term for any language of northern India.
Which 20 of them came from India to Trinidad during indentured.
And in the post-partition period, you're saying that in fact they decided to have identifiable names, but they're all relatable to...
Well, language is something dynamic. Language is something ever evolving. And one looks at this linguistic situation in northern India specifically, because in the Bihar Bhojpuri region, for years, they have fought, these people fought and said that no, Bhojpuri is not Hindi, it's a separate language. Whereas the government of India puts Bihari, Bhojpuri being one of those languages, in a Hindi belt. That belt goes from west to east. It goes Rajasthani, Hindi or Khari Boli, and then Bihari, which has now been divided later on now, more classified into different languages. And that particular region even fought, and I think Dr. Mohan mentioned to me, we had conversations, and she said, well, it will be maybe 3 years now, by an act of parliament, that Bhojpuri is now recognized as a separate language from Hindi. Before it was just a dialect. And that's still even a debatable topic, because the visiting professor from India, well, he's leaving now, Dr. Gupta, and I had a discussion about it, and he still is convinced that Bhojpuri is a dialect, when I was like, no, it's not a dialect. And I gave examples of what my grandparents would have said versus what I learned in standard Hindi class.
Right. So basically the words are not all the same, the rules are not all the same. So it's certainly in your estimation, it can be classified as separate.
Yeah. But then one wonders, what is the definition of a language and what is standard? For instance, let's look at England. What is the Queen's English? It's Southern English dialect, and that was standard English. Whereas Scots, which is the closest language to English, which is much north and further north, was seen as broken English, quote unquote.
Well, it's indecipherable to the normal English speaker.
But now, the same situation in India is happening there, where the Scots want identity and said, no, we have our own rules. We spell book, B-U-K, book, which is the Scottish way of saying book. And even the grammar rules have changed. So there is there's actually a drive right now in Scotland to look at Scots. And it has actually, if you look at it, even if you Google it, you'll see Scots as now a separate language from the Southern English dialect.
Now, if we look at the experience here in Trinidad and Tobago, obviously we're talking about the language that some of those who came over would have spoken, which, whether you want to call it Hindustani or Bhojpuri, was something that was peculiar to a region of India. Now, I'm just guessing here, maybe you can shed some light on this, that in fact it would have primarily been an oral language at that point, and having had not being written necessarily, because the people may not have been able to write, there may have been some problems in maintaining it, because there are the formality of writing at least maintains things for a longer period.
And that's also, when you speak about language, you speak about it in context of history and the situations that passed. Let's look at not only that region, but why it is that Bengali has its own standard in writing, why it is Gujarat has its own, why is it Punjab has its own. When we look at the situation there, economically and otherwise, in Bihar, that Bhojpuri region was always a place that was downtrodden and a poor place. So if you look at civilization in general, if you're at a point where it's survival situation, culture and language and standardization doesn't really have anything. At that point, language itself exists as an oral tradition. But when you have acquired economic standing, now you can go into focusing on culture and doing things like standardizing or documenting a language. And it has always remained in that particular region even today. It's only recently that they actually have this outcry in that region to call it a separate language, which is something that happened way in the past with Gujarati, Punjabi and all these other languages, because they now, by an international recognition, and that's at that level, considered separate languages from Hindi. Only recently that happened with Bhojpuri. Our ancestors came at a time when it was seen as just one of the dialects of northern India. And at that point, which if you consider at that point, when we now look back at India after all the changes have taken place, now they actually look at that same language that they would have spoken as now a language separate from Hindi. But you're right, it is an oral tradition. And now even today, the oldest speakers of the languages, nobody actually wrote in Bhojpuri, there's no written. Maybe in oral tradition as opposed to songs, the chutney music we listen to, people would have written. That's the only place you'd probably find where authorship was ascribed, or literature was
ascribed. It makes it difficult for an academic, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Especially when a language is lost in a British system. A lot of people who do their PhDs and try to look at this aspect of the Indian culture, language is a big aspect of culture, have a difficult time transcribing these lyrics and these songs, because over time the pronunciation has changed and it has become so perverted. In some cases it's not recognizable at all. Local classical, you're aware of it? Right.
I've been around the block a few times. So
I am usually ask people, and not everybody knows, so usually ask. I have been doing some work with respect to part of my language research personal. I'm actually documenting the lyrics, and because I know the language Hindi and I could speak. And when you listen to some of these songs, sometimes you can't understand because the words either is unclear, recording that time was bad, so the instruments would be above the voice. And then the other thing is, you play it over and over and realize that the word pronunciation isn't what you know, it's to be accustomed to what it's supposed to be. So I actually went through these songs and had to actually go to people from Suriname, because Suriname, the language is still alive, they speak it still, to look, and sometimes it was it wasn't recognizable to the extent that we had to create words to fit into it for it to make sense. Wow. So that change has taken place over all these decades since indentureship.
No, I know that the presentation is the language of the indentured laborers. I don't know if language is regarded there as a plural, but presumably there would have been different, whether you want to call it dialects or languages, that they would have spoken. What was the lingua franca, or was there a lingua franca? Yeah.
A lot of these people came from this one particular region, which is northeastern India. So they're talking about Patna. So if I was to define that, that will be West Bihar and Eastern UP on that border.
Right.
That is smack dab in the middle of a transition point between languages in India. That's why I think it's so confusing. Yes, they would have spoken different dialects. Some would have come from South India, so they would have spoken something that couldn't be understood. And that's an interesting thing I'll come back to in a second. But these were mutually intelligible dialects at that point because it was in close vicinity. But so much time has passed and they had to interact with each other that something new came out of it. A new language evolved. So that, so new that even they assimilated French words and they assimilated later on English words. I do some recordings that Dr. Peggy Mohan does. I actually do the same thing now. I would record old Indian people saying what we call kissa, which is a story. And I would listen to it and translate and transcribe it. And there would be a lot of English words in it. and even French words. Two examples Dr. Mohan drew to my attention when I was listening was moulé. We say for factory here for Trinidad Hindustani, comes from moulin in French. And the other one is dimanche. They say for Sunday or week, comes from dimanche in French. Okay. And one popular English word is table. They say table wa. Wa is an ending they use at the end for definitiveness. They say table wa. My grandmother would say that, and kitchen wa. Table wa and kitchen wa. A lot of English words from the kitchen came into that vernacular as well.
We invented our own version of Esperanto, apparently.
Exactly. And I would call it one dialect of the Bhojpuri.
It's interesting, I guess, because even though somebody now would think, well, why couldn't they all just speak Hindi? That was just as alien to many of them, standard Hindi, if there was such a thing even at the time.
You're right. The word Hindi, it was after partition that I mentioned. And okay, to explain what is standard Hindi in a pre-partition concept, one looks at language in general and looks at what determines what is the standard. A lot of things determine that, politically, financially, and otherwise. English, for example, we took the monarch spoke that southern dialect, so what language the monarch speaks is the standard. Spanish is the next example of that.
Even though RP emerged even after that as an invented version of English, which is
exactly.
even more proper, yes.
Right. So the British ruled from Delhi, so that they would document that language, and the British would have to learn a dialect to communicate. So they learned that Khari Boli. Khari Boli is that dialect in Delhi, in New Delhi, and because they learned and documented that, through documentation, that's one process in which a language becomes standard.
And formalized.
Exactly. So that is how, essentially, that Khari Boli became to be standard Hindi. And that Khari Boli dialect, which is from Delhi, you want to call it more of a central vernacular of the Hindustani languages, now has, in present day, post-partition, it become standard Hindi and taught in formal classes.
So almost the same idea with Germany. Berlin German would have become the de facto standard of proper German, even though there's nothing particularly special about it or saying it's any better than the dialect of southern Germany.
Exactly. And that whole idea to use that vernacular as a standard became more pervasive in a post-partition concept. But our ancestors, I remember Dr. Mohan asked me once to get in contact with an author who is doing something on Bhojpuri films, which is something popular in India now. From my perspective as somebody from Trinidad. And I said, I remember distinctly, that our ancestors came here, there was no media. We didn't know what was going on in India until later in the 1940s when we started seeing the films. Mm-hmm. But by that time things had changed partition-wise, and we heard Urdu on the TV, and we said, but that's not the language we speak, and if that is from India, then what we speak probably is not the correct thing. And that's just my idea of how it probably would have developed, that they spoke a broken...
But there would have been a sort of a splitting away as one society kept moving in one direction and the other
exactly.
one... I think of Quebecois French.
Yes.
And Standard French.
Another parallel to what I'm speaking about, yeah.
So that's really interesting. We only have about 7 minutes left, and we could talk about this for hours and hours. But before I forget about the fact that you've got this presentation coming up tomorrow, the language of the indentured laborers, what was the genesis of that particular idea? And it's coming up on Indian Arrival Day, no small coincidence, I'm sure.
Right, yes. So the Caribbean campus, that they operate through Lloyd Best. I remember they were advertising a class for Patois for 12 weeks earlier this year, and I jumped at that because language is something I do, one of my passions apart from medicine. Mm-hmm. I joined that class and I saw that they're taking the Trinidad Patois, which is even not different, but mutually intelligible, but different from St. Lucian Patois, all the Antillean Creoles, and they standardize and formally teaching it. And I thought, but then Trinidad Hindustani / Bhojpuri could be also something that we can consider to do in this way. So I mentioned the idea, and we took it, and I said, okay, I have some research, I have some material, we could sit down and come up with a plan to actually formalize a Trinidad Bhojpuri course along the same lines. So we thought about it, it's still in the process of being made, we're still discussing ideas, but out of that discussion came this presentation as an introduction to that course, which would be hopefully something
here's what we're talking about, kind of thing, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Because it's a sensitization move to actually tell the audience about the language of the ancestors, its origins, its when it came to Trinidad, how it changed How is it different from standard Hindi? Because that's a question a lot of people ask. It was a misconception at one point that it is broken Hindi. It's not. It's a separate language from Hindi, with its own, as we discussed, grammar rules, syntax, semantics, and all that.
Right. So that's, and it's going to be taking place, just to get this out of the way as well, tomorrow at what time?
Tomorrow at the Lloyd Best Institute, Tunapuna Road in Tunapuna, from 6 p.m. to 9 p.m.
People just show up if they're interested and hope for the best so they get a seat.
Yeah.
But it seems to me, I mean, I know Bhojpuri or Hindustani. From what I got, I remember when Peggy was doing her research, I was a young kid then, and I would drive around with her. But then her concern was, and I guess many people in the field, well, there weren't that many in the field, if I'm honest, but the concern of others would have been that it's a dying language, and let's at least preserve it while we can. When you do something like this and you're looking at having the court, isn't that trying to like pin down Quicksilver, because so many elements of it have sort of changed or become immutably changed over the years?
To some extent, yes, and that is what would make it unique. The speakers I record, who usually over 80, still speak from the standard Hindi I learn. I could still understand what they say. It will be mutually intelligible, because one of the interviews I have somebody who is from Bihar, came to Trinidad to live, and she does some of the interviews with me. She speaks Indian Bhojpuri or post-partition Bhojpuri, and she speaks it to somebody from Trinidad, and they have a normal conversation. So the element's still there. Yes, it's dying, even like Patois. But in an English society like Trinidad, and like most of our post-colonial countries, all indigenous languages and also the ethnic languages have died. It has happened is happening in Suriname, even though we want to say that still Hindustani is alive in Suriname. Suriname they call it. Slowly and slowly you find even the younger folk, they don't understand it as much. They understand, but not as much as maybe their parents would have. So the same process is taking place, but at a much slower rate, which in the next 100 years, one wonders what would be the situation.
Does it gradually become absorbed, any language become absorbed into the sort of dominant language, or the words suddenly start appearing in the...
Let me use English as an example, and tomorrow I think I'd want to use it as well. A lot of English is actually a Germanic language. It comes from one of the sister language of German from Anglo-Saxon, and it also has a mixture of both Norman French, which is a dialect of Old French, and that represents when France, the Normans actually invaded England and took over from the Anglo-Saxons. To form English at that point, Old English is Anglo-Saxon, which is similar to, well, same roots as modern day High German and even Dutch. But then you had Norman French coming on top of it, and so they interacted. So now you have Anglo-Saxon grammar structure and they call it substrate, with a vocabulary that comes from Norman French. Patois is another example of that, where you have West African languages forming the substrate, and the superstrate is standard French. So now you have a dynamic where you have West African language grammar structure and foundation with a French vocabulary. So looking at language itself, it is something dynamic. It is something that changes over time, and it's just like a living being. It lives with human beings as human beings move.
But there's a general assumption, because most of us will speak English, that English always was this way and always will be this way, and it came just exactly this way from the moment it was invented. Whereas, as you mentioned, the history is long, complex, and
exactly,
we shouldn't forget that English was called a bastard language for a very long time, and probably still is by some people.
And even just to look at quickly the roots of Sanskrit and Latin, for instance, all the Romance languages, they say, come from Latin, but not classical Latin or the recorded which was academic variety. They came from the spoken vernaculars of Pig Latin or Vulgar Latin. So French came from its own Frankish Latin, that language spoken in the kingdom. The same thing happened in India, where you had Sanskrits. We call the equivalent to Vulgar Latin is Prakrit. Prakrit comes from the Sanskrit word Prakriti, which means natural. And those were the spoken vernaculars. The major ones were Shauraseni Prakrit, this is Western. Then you had Magadhi Prakrit, and then you had Maharashtra Prakrit. Bhojpuri comes from the Western spoken vernacular, and Hindi comes from the Eastern, and Hindi comes from the Western. So looking at that parallel with even Europe, if French and Italian are two separate languages on the basis that they come from different vernaculars of Latin, the same could be said for Bhojpuri, which comes from an Eastern or Magadhi Prakrit, whereas Hindi or Khari Boli comes from a Shauraseni Prakrit.
This is all just really fascinating. I'll have to have you on again when you're not
Sure.
actively healing people, as is your normal job. We're completely out of time. I want to mention that it's the language of the Indentured Laborers. It's taking place tomorrow at the Lloyd Best Institute.
Yes.
24th. It airs tomorrow morning is all this program. And people can just show up and hope they get a seat.
Hope they get a seat, I hope.
And it's not to teach you the language. It's to talk about the language itself,
Yes.
its history, its origin, where it is now, and to lay the foundation for a course.
Exactly. You want to talk about language within the context of the history and indentureship in view of Indian Heritage Month.
Dr. Visham Bhimull, it's been a pleasure having you in the program. And seriously, you have to come on again because this
Sure,
conversation can go on for hours. Thank you so much for being here.
I enjoyed it. It was a
Thank
pleasure.
you. You've been watching One on One. Join us again tomorrow for another edition.